Robert. So as Robert mentioned, our next speaker is Will Hagan, and he is with Moss Landing. And he's going to be coming up to talk specifically about quality assurance. So a big emphasis about the session we're having here is in-stream flows, but a big discussion point, or the main discussion point here, has been data, data, data. And so how do we ensure that the data that we're getting to inform our in-stream flow requirements and recommendations and criteria, whatever it may be, how do we ensure that that data has the right and appropriate level of quality that we can rely upon it and make decisions associated with it? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Will.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and thank you as well to my collaborators, Beverly Van Buren, also out of Moss Landing, and Robert Holmes, who hopefully you haven't forgotten about yet. So today I'm going to talk about, let me advance here. There we go. So today I'm going to talk briefly about the partnership between the two groups, our QA services group and the in-stream flow program at Fish and Wildlife. I'm going to talk about a few different aspects of flow study defensibility, some of the historical challenges that there have been, why it's important in the first place, and then how it may be defined differently depending on the anticipated end use of the study. I'm also going to talk about the QA system that we've created with the Fish and Wildlife in-stream flow program, and I'll put a bit of emphasis on peer review as well, and particularly as it pertains to study planning. And then finally, I'm going to give some QA examples from 3 in-stream flow program studies that were performed on the Big Sur River, and Robert briefly touched on those. And then I will wrap it up. Okay, so our QA services group began working with the in-stream flow program in 2012 after it became clear that technical reports, external technical reports being reviewed by the in-stream flow program varied considerably in their scope and completeness, showed a lack of comparability with regard to methods, models, site selection, data management, and in general, the paper trail of supporting information was considered insufficient. So we felt that it was important to shore up these QA systems, given that various codes and policies mandate that we quantify flow regimes in order to make recommendations related to resource allocation, in-stream flow levels, critical species, and habitat. And these mandates need to be considered during study planning, since they tell us how study information may ultimately be used. So for example, work performed in the interest of one or more of those codes or mandates may be more likely to wind up in a hearing situation. And so with that possibility comes a need for increased defensibility. Okay, and so for this reason, we worked with the in-stream flow program on a QA system that basically consists of, oops, did I jump ahead? There we go. That ultimately consists of procedural documents for study planning and implementation, templates and checklists to assist in the creation of study plans and in the end, technical reports, fact sheets and training programs to provide outreach to anyone considering, planning, or implementing an in-stream flow study. And I'm just going to real quickly zip through some of the tools here. So to date, we've developed 6 standard operating procedures on topics like discharge measurements, wetted perimeter method, critical riffle analysis. And these SOPs are supplemented by guidance documents that allow us to sort of delve into some more specific technical topics. Okay, we've also developed a template for study plan creation that builds on the type of information that you might see in a statement of work. And I'm going to elaborate on study plans. There's also a checklist that ensures the submittal of complete and consistent technical reports when the study is over. And then we've found that fact sheets provide a valuable form of outreach that allows us to focus on some of the less technical aspects of in-stream flow. And so finally, we provide trainings on a variety of in-stream flow topics. And last summer, Robert Holmes and his team of scientists and engineers hosted a training session for some of the regions and programs in Department of Fish and Wildlife. And there's another round scheduled, I believe, for this August. Oops. And while we're here, I just wanted to point out that the example presentation shown just happens to be on study plans. So that takes us to what is a study plan. So basically a study plan by whatever name, and it doesn't, sometimes a specific document name refers to a very specific set of, a very specific scope or content. But basically it's just a document that formalizes various aspects of the study. So objectives, this may include any of those applicable codes or policies that we saw earlier. Personnel to facilitate communication, but also to help define roles and responsibilities. Other logistics like scheduling, site locations, maps might be involved. Utilize procedures, quality assurance like we're talking about, data management. And the last point at the bottom there is key because without an actual physical study planning document, there really is nothing that you can distribute to others for peer review. A statement of work doesn't provide sufficient detail. And without the possibility of peer review, defensibility is likely going to suffer. Okay. So why all the fuss about peer review? So first, it confirms the scientific defensibility of the technical aspects of the study, and I'll be elaborating on that a bit. But also, by its very nature, peer review is a form of collaboration and often interagency collaboration. And so with this comes the opportunity for future partnerships, or at the very least, coordination about ongoing projects you might have or projects that you might have planned. And also because historical data and data from other organizations are such a big part of in-stream flow, the interagency trust becomes an even more important thing. And that's why you want all the various organizations who are performing these studies to develop a history together. And obviously, that wasn't lost on the organizers of this symposium. And so the question becomes, well, what aspects of flow studies should be peer reviewed? Site selection has been mentioned, I think, by all the speakers, basically, and needs to be reviewed during study planning. Likewise, method selection that's also been touched on, and that includes any modifications to those methods as well. So that's sort of before the study. On the other hand, things like model calibration and statistical performance come into play primarily at the end. And don't forget those core riverine components that Robert mentioned: biology, hydrology, connectivity, geomorphology, and water quality. And then depending on the degree of scrutiny required, you could also look at things like staff qualifications and intercomparison studies. Okay, so I want to emphasize that on one hand, this does look like quite a laundry list of things that are in need of peer review, but on the other hand, if things like this get sufficiently addressed in a study plan, then suddenly that laundry list sort of disappears and the reviewer only has one thing to worry about, essentially. Oops, this keeps advancing without me touching anything. Anyway, it'll sneak preview for you. Anyway, so let's go ahead and apply this. So in 2014, the Instream Flow program created these, there's doing it again. They created these three peer-reviewed technical reports on various aspects of in-stream flow on the Big Sur. And we felt that these three technical reports warranted such a thorough review because they were the basis of in-stream flow program flow regime prescriptions that may ultimately be used for the state board's water allocation decisions. Okay, so for this reason, our QA group performed an independent third-party review of the three technical reports, and this basically consisted of two parts. The first was a 2-day on-site audit of the in-stream flow program with specific regard to the planning, implementation, and reporting associated with those Big Sur studies and the resulting technical reports. The second part of the study, or excuse me, of the review actually scrutinized the technical reports themselves and resulted in a documented system for such reviews. And as important as it was to create the system, it was equally important to memorialize it for ongoing use. This ensures that review findings would be consistent among multiple reviewers, but also reproducible for the same reviewer over time. And this is key because depending on the number of technical reports in need of review, the workload may not be manageable by a single reviewer, and that was what we found in our case. We had 3 reviewers looking at 3 technical reports, basically. And so the result of our audit and our document review was a 38-page QA report that ultimately focuses on different aspects of defensibility. And the scope of the report is shown here and is, fairly familiar at this point. Oops, there it goes again. And the QA report's conclusion became sort of a report card on the usability of the 3 Big Sur River studies. Okay, so just real quickly, here are the findings with regard to that review scope that we just saw. And as I mentioned before, because we memorialized our review process, the goal is that these same findings would result from a subsequent review or from a review by another reviewer. Okay, so because the study data and supporting information was well documented, because the technical aspects of the study were reviewed by scientists and engineers, and because of that QA report card, we concluded that the 3 Big Sur River studies and the resulting technical reports were usable for the state board's decision-making process. And we concluded this knowing that the bar for defensibility gets raised in a hearing situation. Wow, it's getting good at guessing when I need to advance the slides. So as I mentioned, our review resulted in a 38-page QA report. And while this seems like a lot, this was actually distilled down from, I believe, about 400 pages of technical reports spanning the 3 studies. And so it's a logistical improvement, but it's still 38 pages. And so we just developed a summary letter that accompanied the QA report, and it serves really as a communication tool between the Department of Fish and Wildlife's in-stream flow program and the state board. And the goal was just to provide a more concise, objective documentation that the Big Sur River work was usable in water allocation decisions. Okay, so just some final thoughts, or at least those that I have time for. The first is that a couple of times I cited those policies and codes that mandate that that in-stream flow work be performed, but I think it's important to note that those policies and codes don't address things on sort of the nuts and bolts level that we've looked at today. So for example, they're not going to specify what should be included in a study plan in a technical report, and pretty much all the stages in between. And this is a huge contrast from, say, the chemistry world, where there's seemingly an endless amount of guidelines and guidance that exists for just about every aspect of data production, data management, data interpretation. And unfortunately, this just isn't the case in Instream Flow, where the challenge is simply trying to find that guidance. And so as a result of this, policies around the nuts and bolts that we've talked about today really need to be set at the study or project or program levels, because if they're not, they might not be set at all. Another takeaway is that the degree of a study's defensibility should be based in part on applicable codes and policies. So we saw how our, in the Big Sur River situation, our QA approach was shaped by the possibility of a hearing. And another consideration is study scale, which I think we've heard about throughout the day. And one last time, I'll mention the importance of peer review, particularly when applied to a formalized planning document before the study actually begins. Because if you decide to postpone your peer review until the study's conclusion, you might not find out about crucial design flaws until it's too late to do anything about them. And so on that cheery note, I will wrap it up. Here's my contact information, or feel free to flag me down or flag Robert down during the day.